Welcome to the We Are Lach podcast. I am Lavinia.
I am Chris.
And I am Heather.
You can find our introduction in the podcast feeds and in the show notes to this episode.
This is our 5th episode and still very experimental.
Yeah, and today we are going to discuss a topic that I love talking about, even though it is actually a horrific topic. It's ecofascism. And I've been working on this topic since 2019 when I started activism with Extinction Rebellion, just as they were in their first few months in the UK. My role was to train the rebels, as we were called, in the principles and values of Extinction Rebellion. And I was only in that role around 5 months or so before I left. I could see that those with structural power in the movement were not listening to Black people, to people of color, to immigrants, to people with disabilities, to working class people. It completely changed my life to have met those folks and learned from them. And what I learned is that without an anti-oppression lens, when we're talking about climate change, then we fall into something that Peter Gelderloot talks about in his book, The Solutions Are Already Here. And he actually just published another book that I haven't had a chance to read yet called They Will Beat the Memory Out of Us. Just the title speaks to the idea that these struggles are historical. They should be placed historically. And if we try to take something like climate change and make it into a single issue campaign without placing it in its correct historical context, without it being grounded in anti-oppression or maybe what we would call justice, then we are vulnerable to falling into eco-fascism.
Heather, if I'm allowed to jump in already here, your journey resonates deeply with me, and I hope also with the listeners, especially the recognition of how movements can reproduce the same oppressive structures they claim to dismantle. So before we delve deeper into ecofascism, I'd love for you to expand on what you mean by like this structural power within movements like Extinction Rebellion, and how do you see this intersecting with capitalist frameworks that exploit both humans and nature?
Well, first I'd say that you said like movements that claim to be dismantling oppressive structures. I think Extinction Rebellion wasn't really claiming to do that. They were trying to come up with a meaningful way to disrupt what was happening with climate change, but they were making demands of the state. You know, they weren't claiming to be dismantling oppressive structures. They were just trying to get the government to do something. So, talking about structural power, case in point, just today, and we are recording this on the 21st of November, the offshoot of Extinction Rebellion, which is called Just Stop Oil, and you may know them for their classic hits, which include pouring soup on famous paintings and interrupting world championship sporting events. They released a statement explaining why they attended a farmers' protest in London, England yesterday, because the far right was in attendance. And by far right, I mean people who do not take an anti-oppression, systemic power approach, who demonize minority groups. So Just Stop Oil was in attendance along with the farmers, along with the far right. And so I'm going to read to you from an older statement put out by ex-Just Stop Oil protesters. And this statement was called, well, the group was called Just Stop Ecofascism. And so a person of color, and they wanted to be anonymous, is referring here to Nigel Farage, who is a far-right politician in the UK. And they say in this statement against Just Stop Oil, they say, When I saw the Nigel Farage post, I was really on edge for a couple of days from the anxiety that it caused. The people in Just Stop Oil are my friends, my comrades, and people I see every day. I was shocked that they would want to be associated with someone who doesn't want people like me to exist. Of all the people to use, why was he chosen for this post? As people of color, we know what he represents. He is known for his racism and for vilifying refugees. I am a child of a refugee myself, so this made me feel unsafe in the climate movement. When we brought it up with people in JSO, Just Stop Oil, we weren't listened to, and we were told that it was clearly a joke. It was a project that they were working on for a long time, and I understand that criticism was hard to hear, but I was disappointed that they were unable to look past their own experiences to listen to me. This did not feel like a joke. They don't have to face public figures who would laugh in jubilation if I died. End quote. So we see how by being willing to associate with people on the far left, that sends a strong signal to people in the climate movement that they're willing to sacrifice demonized people to achieve their climate goals. So, swinging back to your question about power structure, Lavinia, in the open letter that they wrote, they say as well that working from a framework based on a natural hierarchy, that some people are just naturally suited to certain things, gives rise to ageism and other isms. This stereotyping is causing distrust, which leads to exclusion of differing views, resulting in people not being able to challenge the power dynamics within the organization. And I would just add, like in the movement. This promotes coercive behavior leading to consent issues. The behavior becomes an opportunity to attract the far right because it is based on domination and essentialism, two of the foundations of fascism, unquote. So when the far right is not taken into account, when anti-oppression is not the basis for how we respond to climate change, we are vulnerable to falling into eco-fascism.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Heather. And I think a moment ago, you used the phrase far left, and I think you meant to say far right because you were speaking in the context of people, as you said, that that do not take an anti-oppression lens. And I think I might actually explore this a little bit more later in this episode with the three of us in terms of this term, quote, far right, and in which ways this term is useful and perhaps not so useful. But I want to first begin with the term ecofascism because I'm grateful you use this term specifically the term ecofascism in a very intentional way. And my mind goes to many places just with that word. So really for the benefit of our listeners and honestly for my benefit as well, could you tie those things together that you began to talk about and give us a definition of fascism itself as a grounding and really to help us explore the scope of what we're discussing today?
Yeah, and if I said far left, I didn't mean to. Yeah, there are issues with the far left. But yeah, so fascism is even worse than the far right. So I talked about how the far right is like demonizing minorities, demonizing people who face a lot of oppression. And fascism would then be even worse. And it's a contested term because are we talking about the fascism as it played out in Italy in the 30s? Or are we talking about Spain, Germany? Do we mean only a kind of ideology that has political power? And so the issues around definitions is that it can overstate or exaggerate what is really going on, or it can underplay it. So I think what makes sense to me in this context of this episode is to see fascism using violence or the threat of violence to remove or eliminate certain groups of people. It's in its worst form when it is done through the state, which is what people are afraid of happening under the Trump administration. And we see this happening under Modi in India. Muslims are targeted there, for example. So it's like state-sanctioned violence against groups of people, minorities. We could argue that what happens in the US prison system under any political party is aligned with fascism. And just this week, I saw really horrific examples in Louisiana in the prison system of what they're doing. And I don't even want to talk about it, but I will put a link in the show notes to what I'm referring to. So then if that's kind of what we mean by fascism, then with ecofascism, it's again a very strong word and people could think that we're exaggerating something. But I do think it's important that it grabs people's attention. And a couple of years ago, I ran some reading groups on a book called The Rise of Ecofascism by Maureen Roberts. And they, it's in their title, Ecofascism. And then they go on to kind of articulate it and call it more like far right ecologism. And it's about like the history of how the far right has used environmental issues to push for oppressive and sometimes fascistic ideologies. And in fact, the term ecofascism itself originated with the Nazis and their sense of purity in the land, spiritual connection with the land. They didn't want the contamination of others. The majority of the people they targeted and killed were Jewish, and we know that they also killed Blacks, disobedient people, gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, Polish people, their political opponents, Roma and other so-called gypsies and social outsiders. So that's, targeting minorities. And for them, it was trying to purify Germany, trying to protect the land and their spiritual connection to the land. And we see a lot of ways that ecofascism is playing out in the current climate. We've seen mass shootings where they cite ecofascist tropes, like the Great Replacement Theory, which is the belief that whites are being replaced by non-whites. And we know that lots of migration is happening now because of climate and environmental destruction, and that more is to come. And so when the far right offer solutions related to borders and policing and the military, that's problematic. They're not dealing with the root cause of climate change. They're just trying to drive their own ideology using climate change as an excuse. And we can see that even if you do want to address climate change in order to mitigate in terms of emissions, which the far right doesn't do normally because of denialism, then we can see that green technology, batteries and solar panels and all of that, those come at a cost to ecosystems and the lands of indigenous people and other people who do not want that destruction. So that's problematic. Another far-right trope, as we would call it, is blaming climate and environmental destruction on population. This is very common. There are very well-loved celebrities in the UK, for example, that platform this trope. It's dangerous because a solution that involves fewer humans can involve a number of very dangerous strategies for carrying it out. Let's sacrifice some humans around the world. There are people who think we need a virus to wipe out a certain proportion of the population so that the people left can have a better life. And of course, are they proposing that they're the ones that are going to die and be sacrificed for this? No, they're not willing for their families to be the ones that don't have children. And I mean, there are lots of people nowadays, people with privilege that say we're not going to have children because of the polycrises that we are in. But in reality, it's the drain on resources that is coming from a very small number of very well-off people who feel entitled to use up resources and to pollute and to destroy, whereas the vast majority of humans on the planet do not need very many resources to live. And so with Trump being elected in the United States now, he takes office in January, people are talking about fascism a lot more. In fact, I recommend a new podcast by a Dixon that's just started called The Fascism Barometer. And for our podcast, we talk about sustainability a lot. We talk about climate change. And I really want anyone who is in this field, either professionally or as an activist, to take the time to understand how we are vulnerable to ecofascism and to get good at counter narratives. Because the better we are at this kind of messaging, like that we hear from, popular celebrities, we can counter it, and counter these eco-fascist narratives. And to do that, we do need to be grounded in anti-oppression work in everything that we do. Any issue that we care about, if it's not grounded in anti-oppression, it can be manipulated in ways that make us all less safe. And so anyone who's followed my work knows that my tagline is like, let's figure out how to take care of one another and keep each other as safe as possible. And this is part of that work, educating ourselves in that way.
Thanks for that, Heather. In a recent podcast, we also talked briefly about this term, the left, and also earlier today, you used by accident the term far left, and we critiqued the term a little bit. We were asking ourselves, in fact, if that blanket term, the left, was helpful, and if we ourselves are leftists. And today we're exploring this term, the far right, and I'm wondering in what ways that term is useful and not useful. For example, there are so-called far-right elements in the United States that deny human-caused climate change is occurring, while there are quote-unquote far-right elements in Europe that fully acknowledge anthropogenic climate change, but they blame people of color and migrants for it, as you pointed out earlier in our conversation. So could you share a little bit of your thoughts on this term, particularly in the context of today's conversation?
Yeah, so again, from the book, The Rise of Ecofascism, they say how at first the far right will deny climate change. Then they'll be like, oh, okay, all right, there is climate change, but it's not caused by humans. And then they'll say, oh, okay, it is caused by humans, but it's not something urgent. Then they'll say, okay, it's here now. It's too late. So now we need to deal with the consequences by militarizing the borders, for example. So it's not so much that the far right, like that they're so different from like in different countries, but it's more there are different stages of how the far right responds. And and I did describe what the far right is earlier. So I just want to point out that how it plays out is what we're seeing in that way.
And I'm feeling definitely that this conversation, the way that this conversation today is grounded in the term ecofascism and in the term far right and what these terms mean, I believe it's very important. And the major reason is because I believe that a pure focus on the science and mathematics of climate change, which is more my background, does not automatically tell society what should be done in response. And that pure focus on science and math, in my belief, also leaves human emotions unexplored and unspoken to. And for that reason, it leaves people feeling anxious and feeling unsafe and grasping for, and I'm generalizing, but in the context of fascism, the rise of fascism across the Americas, across Europe and other places, it seems to me people expressing this need for a simple so-called solution, and what's being sold is the so-called solution of oppressing peoples, oppressing the other, and really speaking from an us versus them type of lens, oppressing peoples, and in the context of today, in the name of environmental mitigation or in the name of sustainability. And you've already pointed out, Heather, that these views are very insidious and in certain cases even mainstream. You already talked about celebrities that would be, to use your word, horrified to see that they were espousing fascist views. But then again, and unfortunately, through my observations of certain, shall we say, entities in the United States, I do feel that there are some celebrities or visible people, certainly certain very visible politicians who are very much open about and proud of their fascism and speak about these things very publicly, almost as a form of marketing for themselves. And we've seen this time and time again here in the US. And of course, in the context of genocide, the context of Palestine and other genocides, we've talked about that as well in earlier episodes of our podcast.
That's so true, Chris. I think we are seeing here that following these fascist narratives shows that we are not in this together, right? And I think we also have to ask ourselves, what are the emotional and psychological narratives ecofascism taps into? So, Heather, could we go back a little bit in our conversation, and could you speak to how fear, especially fear of scarcity and or loss, is weaponized by the far right, and how we might counter those narratives with ones, as you always say, rooted in care, solidarity, and abundance?
Yeah. Thanks, Lavinia. Yeah, I can speak to that by going back to that same open letter that the Just Stop Oil activists who left Just Stop Oil wrote. And they point out a sense of urgency, which is one of the white supremacy culture patterns. And they're calling it urgency culture. They say, quote, "This allows the continuation of eco-fascist tactics and narratives under the guise of urgent action. Those who might otherwise stop to challenge oppressive belief systems that we have all inherited from society are no longer given the incubation time to do so. Themes of sacrifice, honor, and responsibility are leaving people desperate, creating a burnout culture and setting a dangerous precedent for harm against each other and to ourselves," unquote. So this, although it's specifically speaking to what happens to activists within the movement, it also identifies how the general public, too, will feel afraid by the science, the news, by leaders of climate change movements, and this will send our nervous systems into an unregulated space. We won't stop and think about what is going on, who is being sacrificed in the name of climate change. You know, one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, and then he went on to co-found Just Stop Oil, is Roger Hallam. And I know Roger. I was in Switzerland with him when he was speaking at a Fridays for Future event. And I went with my daughter, who was an Extinction Rebellion activist and Fridays for Future activist. And I remember walking with him. I think it was our first conversation. I picked him up from the train station and he said, yeah, I'm targeting middle-class women. Because well, he didn't say why, but what it is that middle-class women have they're like the age he was talking about were women who were on like getting their pension. So they'd stopped work. So they have like some income and they've got time. They've got that privilege of time to be able to like volunteer for different things. And so he uses fear to get people to like commit to devoting their lives, their time to climate change movement. And he weaponizes not just like the fear of climate change, But he will use he will talk about the Holocaust. He will talk about rape as a way of manipulating people into being so afraid that they will be willing to take drastic and often self-harming action on behalf of the environment. And he will say that if you really care about the environment, then you will be willing to do what I say. It is so dangerous. And also when targeting young people who are, looking at the news, they see what's happening, they're really scared. They don't see anyone taking, real action, because it's true, governments are not taking action, good enough action. And they listen to someone like Roger Hallam, and they are willing to, there's videos of them setting themselves on fire, things like that. Really dangerous. Because there isn't this like grounding in that we need to care about each other, that we need to build community, that it's based on anti-oppression, that we don't want people to be manipulated in any context whatsoever. So you ask, like, how do we counter this? And it's absolutely with relationship building. We need to be in relationship with people, especially with the people who are benefiting the least from this system. The three of us hosting this, we benefit quite a bit from the system. And so that makes it very hard for us to see the reality of the system. If we benefit so much from it, there are parts of us that are going to be afraid of losing the system because then we're going to lose those benefits. But the majority of the people on the planet do not benefit from the system. Yet they're exactly the ones who know how the system works. They're not, kidded by it or anything. They're not under any kind of illusion that, oh, but part of it is actually pretty good because we're benefiting. No. And they also know how to survive despite the system. And that's something people like us worry about. How are we going to survive without capitalism, without liberal democracy? Like, oh my gosh, what would happen if we didn't have borders and police and prisons? The more we build relationships with people who suffer under the system, the more our nervous systems will be settled and the more motivation we will have to end the system and replace it, because we won't be able to bear seeing our friends and loved ones being harmed in this way any longer.
I also see eco-fascism on the rise after what you said, Heather, precisely again or continually in Germany and also within my community and my sustainability bubble, actually. Because, right now in 2024, over here in Germany, we have a militarized Green Party, which is part of the government. And the narrative around climate talks is highly elitist, classist, and so on and so forth. And our government, in whose coalition the Green Party is, the Green Party is part, supports the idea of borders and not accepting climate migrants. It is devastating. And also the Fridays for Future movement, hand in hand with the Greens, with the Green Party over here, campaigns basically for a clean planet for the clean and rich people. So all of this in our conversation reminds me of one of my favorite books, Ecofeminism by Vandana Shiva and Maria Mies, published in 1993, so many, many years ago, actually. It was here that I first encountered the term fascism applied to environmental movements. Given the fact that I am German, I was born in Germany, and the history of Germans and the anti-Semitic and fascist Nazi ideology is known to me and my folks, right? So the two authors emphasized the dangers of authoritarian solutions to ecological crises, especially those that scapegoat marginalized groups. And this is what is happening precisely in Germany right in this moment. So reading their work and, having this conversation with both of you feels like peeling back like a couple of layers of greenwashing to uncover the systemic injustices at the core of environmental exploitation. And then lately, I have been also reading a lot about eco-socialism, and I find eco-socialism particularly compelling because it addresses, at least from what I read, the root issues, right? Capitalism's extractivism, global inequalities, and its exploitation of both labor and nature. Heather, how do you see this perspective influencing the broader fight against eco-fascism, or am I romanticizing here what I tend to do with regard to socialism? Please hold me accountable.
Normally, I would be pro-romantic things, but yeah. The thing about socialism, the way I understand it, is that it does imply a state. And I really do encourage folks to read that Peter Gelderloop book, The Solutions Are Already Here, because it gives loads of examples of how the state is not set up to save us. There's so many disincentives, perverse incentives. I know we talked about this in other episodes when we start to bring in economics and things, but even the states themselves, they have perverse incentives for what they do. And so I guess I would also go back to our conversation we had last time about vision and about being grounded in principles and values. And just like I said earlier, like we have to be grounded in anti-oppression. So I mean, I'm not going to be against socialists or socialist ideas on how to respond appropriately to climate change. But I would just say, let's keep anti-oppression in mind because the state is inherently violent, in my opinion. It has borders. And so any proposed solution or response to climate change needs to have that in mind that, where is there oppression taking place? Where are we sacrificing people for some greater good? And so that's the only thing I would say is that if anyone's talking about socialism, to keep questioning where the oppression is so that it's so people don't forget that it's hidden in many cases, especially people with privilege. It will be hidden, like we talked about in your episode about fashion. You're just wearing your clothes every day and you don't notice what oppression is happening. And I think that can happen with people feeling really scared about the extreme weather temperatures, the flooding. We've just had a cyclone bomb, I think, in the Pacific Northwest in the United States and, part of Canada. People died. There's just weather phenomena happening. People are scared. And so I wouldn't want anyone to get sucked into thinking that just because the word socialism is being used, that it's not got something darker behind it. So that's an issue with labels, which is why I think I'm really coming around to the idea that we need to be grounded in principles, no matter what definitions people are using.
Yeah, Heather, what you say brings so many things to mind. And in fact, your very last sentence brought even some further thoughts to my mind that I'd like to just take a moment to work through in community with the two of you, if I could. The first thing that was brought to my mind is we've talked about climate migration and this us versus them lens and the idea of keeping, quote unquote, them out as one of the factors that makes fascism and eco-fascism in particular a form of eco-fascism. And I wanted to raise my view explicitly in terms of taking a systems lens on what we're talking about. A couple of weeks ago, a good friend of mine gave me a podcast episode on YouTube. I can't remember the title, but it was the woman named Brianna Joy Gray interviewing Dr. Fidel Kaboub. And this is under the podcast named Bad Faith, which is Brianna's podcast. And Dr. Kaboub started by talking about the material and financial flows manifested in global capitalism as a result of European colonization. And essentially what he said is that the system is set up to extract resources from the lowest cost location possible, which is typically global south, then transport those resources up to areas where those resources are made into quote unquote higher value products. And this is typically in the global north. And then ideally, these global north entities will be able to sell those resources in the form of products back to global south countries. And one of the other points that Dr. Kaboub made is that the global north will also dump obsolete technology into global south countries. And during the fashion episode, we also talked explicitly about material waste being dumped in countries. And I think the overall banner of this particular podcast episode was the development, of Africa, the path to development of the African continent. And his catchphrase, Dr. Kaboub's catchphrase, was decolonize to decarbonize. And there are many ways we could take that phrase in terms of analysis. But what it brings to my mind in the context of this conversation is that the system, quote unquote, if we're just going to use a phrase, the system is set up to make financial flows easy, make material flows across borders very easy, but make flows of people across borders extremely difficult and increasingly difficult, as we see in fascist rhetoric. When, in my belief, the very reason that people are increasingly trying to flow across borders is because the places they're coming from have been extracted from in the name of globalization and global capitalism, again, as manifested in the history of European colonization, which was intended to extract resources from the lowest cost areas. And there's no lower cost than being able to enslave people and force them to give you whatever you want for quote unquote free under the threat of violence. So when we talk about climate migration, in my mind, it is very much connected to the way global business is set up. And the desire to keep people out, I see, is intentionally divorced from the conversation about why are people trying to move in the first place. And I think it's important when we take an anti-oppression lens to always center this system's perspective on what are the drivers of the things that are happening. Because in my mind, unfortunately, when I look at these fundamental drivers, I see a picture where climate migration, if you want to use that term, maybe the term itself has some issues, but I see a world where climate migration will increase, rapidly increase within our lifetimes. And if we're not careful, if we, I want to use that word carefully, if we as a society are not careful, then with that increasing migration will come increasing amplification of eco-fascist narratives and indeed actual violence against people. So it is very concerning to me, and certainly I'm wondering, what is my place? What is my work to do in supporting people? And of course, in community, particularly with the two of you, in the forms in which we work together, what is our work to do to continue to raise consciousness, to surface and show people that these undercurrents are real, that they exist, and that people weaponize fears. They weaponize anxieties of people, very real human emotions, that there are certain elements taking advantage of and twisting and serving their own ends. And I believe our podcast is one example of the work that is ours to do. And I will continue to look for other ways to practice anti-oppression in the context of now and the near future and the far future as well.
Yeah, I mean, we see the violence happening now, like the violence against Haitians as they were trying to cross the border between Mexico and the United States, the criminalization of giving water and food to migrants, the criminalization in Europe of like taking a boat out to rescue people. It's that's happening, isn't it? And yes, it will just get worse. Yeah, being able to counter this. I mean, it's like you said earlier, Chris, that people want like simple solutions. And so if it's like, oh, this one thing is happening, here's the answer to it without looking at the why behind it. It's even people, people who say, oh, the war in Gaza that started on October 7th, 2023, it's like they want it to it's simple to say that out of nowhere, for no reason whatsoever, some groups of Palestinians uh, entered illegally Israel and killed people. They want that to be the narrative. And then, of course, we have a right to defend ourselves, without looking at, this huge history behind it. And as you say, why do people need to move? I mean, look at me. I'm someone with 3 passports. Like that is so much privilege to be able to be like, well, and I don't need an excuse to go between these 3 countries. Like for me, the border's open. And I don't need to have a reason to say, well, it's because in the UK it was getting really rainy, so I came to Colombia, and next I'm going to go to the US because there's a drought here. No, I don't need an excuse. Why? What the luck of who I was born to and then who I married, that was just like luck that I don't need a reason to move between these 3 countries. And yet, for so many people, the border is not just closed, but it's like a death camp for people and citizens of the countries that they're trying to get into are criminalized for wanting to help them. It's just horrific. But that's why, yeah, we need to be kind of be aware of where sneaky things can come in, because like in Extinction Rebellion, for example, the far right will like attend meetings and people don't notice that, because it's like, yeah, we have to worry about this. But yeah, it can sneak in. And so people need to not be vulnerable to this. And we are vulnerable because of the fear and because we're not good at looking at things systemically because of like more white supremacy culture patterns around binary thinking and that sense of urgency. So yeah, I think the work that we're doing, I mean, I, I do have another, I'm running an intro to ecofascism tomorrow, which will be too late for this podcast, but I'm doing another one in December. and I will meet demand for that as necessary. They're just 1 hour in length, and they're just to get people to be thinking about these topics. And particularly, there are people in the United States, like climate change educators, that are really scared about how they could be targeted for trying to teach climate change as if it's real when the people, the authorities say it's not. So that's a real fear. And then especially if they want to kind of raise it in a, talking about systemic power and oppression, they're really afraid of being targeted. So this is like really on the ground dangerous for people. And so we need to create spaces where people can talk openly about their fears and organize to protect one another. Um, it's not just climate change stuff, but trans issues and targeting of migrants. All of this is now for people in the United States, at least, plus there are other countries where I think liberals need to quit thinking that there's this kind of inevitability of progress where this can't possibly be happening. That's what happened in the past. This can't be happening now. It is happening now. So, yeah, Lavinia.
Yeah, just wanted to quickly jump in as you were talking about climate change deniers. And what I am observing is that there are actually less climate change deniers. Even folks from the far right have understood that there's climate change and that they have to act. But what I am like personally and also in my work, like very, very, very worried about, and I think this is a kind of fear, is the adaptation and mitigation strategies of the far right with regard to the climate crisis and climate change. And I think there we have to be like really, really, really very cautious. And I think this is where, again, eco-fascism comes in. So I'm not seeing so many climate change deniers anymore. I think there has been a shift, specifically in the last 2 years, I think. But I mean, right now, COP is happening in Baku, and what I am reading about the so-called adaptation and mitigation strategies, it's it's horrific and highly, highly, highly oppressive solutions they are representing there. Yeah, that's just what I wanted to add here.
Yeah, I know that we're coming to the end of this episode, and we're seeing, or maybe I should say, I'm seeing something I see often in our podcast, which is that we depart really, I think, with more questions than answers, yes, but we also depart our episodes with a sort of shared understanding, which is why I think this series of conversations between us is so great. That yes, we see that there's so much more to talk about, but there's a sharing, and there's a shared value system. There's a commonality, I think, that we express, which I think is fantastic.
Speaking of COP, I'm very excited that our next episode will be about the recent biodiversity conference of the parties in Cali, Colombia. And Heather, your two cousins attended and will also be joining us for this discussion.
Yeah, yeah. I was really happy to see that they were chatting in our family WhatsApp group, and one of them was showing, "Oh, I've just landed." Kika, she said, "I've just landed." And then Maria Lucia said, "Oh, I'm going to be there as well." And then they were sending photos. And then you said how you would like to discuss the cops. And I thought, well, perfect. Let's find out what it was like to actually be there. Their perspective isn't from like a policy side, it's more indigenous, like what the impact is on indigenous peoples in Colombia, when it comes to things like COP and biodiversity. So I'm really excited to be able to invite them on here and to talk, and you get to meet them both.
Yeah, I'm also looking forward to it. And as always, I look forward to our future episodes just in general. So for our listeners, until then, please check out the show notes. And a big thanks to Alex in Wonderland for the theme song, Climb Aboard. Thank
Bye,
you, fellow
Lucky.
Locks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Talk to you next time.